not far from where the Atlantic Ocean washes our coast. Not far from our marshlands so profuse with wildlife. Just inland, where stands of pine begin their march steadily west. A huge man-made shape rises from the landscape, appearing through breaks in the loblollies where the Pasquotank River widens into Albemarle Sound. Looming, towering, like a cathedral in the pines. But this building was made to house the tools of war during a time of rising threat in our nation's history. Even if you're intimately familiar with this place and come here to work every day, when your eyes first perceive the immensity of this vast indoor space, they find it hard to pinpoint reality. You can't help but be awestruck. Even when you finally get it and decide that what you're seeing actually exists, you may still ask, why? By the time the U.S. officially entered World War II in December 1941, the German undersea menace that had been developed during World War I was well established. Convoys across the North Atlantic were being attacked by submarines seemingly at will. Millions of tons of shipping and many thousands of sailors and merchant seamen, along with desperately needed war material headed for Europe, went to the bottom. President Franklin Delano Roosevelt had words for the Germans. He called their U-boats the rattlesnakes of the Atlantic. Winston Churchill simply referred to them as dastardly villains. Most North Carolina residents were largely unaware of the threat lurking not far off our state's beaches. Locals sometimes watched in horror as German subs sank ships within sight of their homes. To keep news of the German sub successes close to home, an influx of mail from the government warned coastal people about loose lips sinking ships.
No matter how long it may take us, the American people in their righteous might will win through to absolute victory.
Something had to be done about the subs lurking off our coast. In fact, several months prior to the U.S. entering the war, construction already had begun on a behemoth steel hangar southeast of Elizabeth City. The giant building was designed to house lighter-than-air patrol craft that would be used to buttress the Atlantic Fleet's anti-submarine capability around Cape Hatteras. The giant hangar at Weeksville harbored a secret weapon of sorts, one that eventually would help turn the tide in the Atlantic. The local community welcomed the airship base. It not only meant a buildup in coastal defenses, but defense jobs for people in Elizabeth City, Weeksville, and surrounding areas. The sight of the graceful dirigibles lifting into the air and the idea of taking the battle to the Germans were great morale boosters. But there also were plenty of skeptics out there. It was hard to imagine how these slow, ponderous blimps could make a difference. The Weeksville Hangar was the oversized centerpiece of an 822-acre facility, which included barracks for 700 enlisted men and 150 officers at peak operation. A second, slightly larger hangar, also called an air dock, was completed on the base in July of 1943. This one made of wood, because steel was needed elsewhere in the war. Today, Hangar 1 is as overwhelming as ever. About as long as 3 football fields, and wider than a football field is long, with steel trusses forming a graceful arch 18 to 20 stories up, and a distinctive curved roofline to help the building withstand high winds. Dimensions like these allowed as many as 12 airships inside at one time, with no support columns to get in the way. Taking in the space is one thing. Taking to the ladder is another. Imagine having to climb up to your job in a control tower on the roof, each footstep echoing in the cavernous space. And then, when your shift directing blimps in and out of the base is over, climbing back down. Courage, especially during wartime, clearly is measured in different ways. Today, the hangar is occupied by TCOM, a company that manufactures and repairs modern lighter-than-air craft, a variety of aerostats or tethered balloons used for everything from fixed surveillance to drug interdiction and airborne broadcasting.
Today's aerostats and blimps use a laminate. The strength member is Dacron polyester, as opposed to the blimps that flew from here in the 40s and 50s. They had a cotton fabric coated with rubber.
Both kept aloft by a mixture of helium and air, which is more stable than the hydrogen used by the Germans in their pre-war commercial Zeppelins. Fresh on the minds of many, even today, is the dramatic destruction of the Hindenburg at Lakehurst following its first Atlantic crossing of the season in May 1937. Fire flashed near the tail, and in a half-minute or so, the craft was enveloped in flames as it sank 300 feet to the ground. 35 of the 97 souls aboard perished. And on that tragic note, the era of lighter-than-air passenger travel ended. Later, as the war ground on, the U.S. government saw the potential for using lighter-than-air ships to spot subs. It's more than a bit ironic that a technology for which the Germans were so noted eventually helped neutralize much of their submarine offensive along the Atlantic coast. From 1942 to 1945, Weeksville throbbed to the rhythm of war. The hangar's back hallways and offices buzzed with activity, planning and guiding submarine interdiction flights. Today, they are empty of all but memories.
These old rooms, if these walls could talk, the things they could tell us. From here, decisions were made to send the blimp crews that waited in them to go to war. From here, they'd learn about the weather that they were going to face and the ships they were going to protect. The blimps would fly up the Pasquotank out to the Atlantic Ocean.
Their primary task was to patrol the sea lanes and escort convoys. An airship crew had a simple but crucial advantage over a U-boat captain. They could see his submarine from greater distances, a valuable adjunct to the ship-based radars of the time. Blimps could hover, stay on station longer than fixed-wing aircraft, and patiently await the appearance of a sub, on or just below the surface. But when a sub was spotted, things got stirred up quickly. Surface ships or aircraft could be directed in for the kill. Sometimes, the lighter-than-air ships themselves dropped depth charges. When aimed right, a trick in itself, they would explode close enough to a submarine that the shock wave opened up seams in the hull, marking the beginning of the end for that boat and its crew. The blimps became a new kind of natural enemy for U-boats. There was nowhere for them to hide, and in time, many fewer ships were torpedoed along our coast. After the war, the facility became an auxiliary naval air station. It supported anti-submarine warfare operations during the Korean conflict, but was decommissioned a few years later in 1957. The two colossal hangars also were used for a variety of non-airship purposes over the years, including the storage of fixed-wing military aircraft between 1945 and 1948.
In fact, there were over 600 aircraft stored in the two hangars and over 1,500 vehicles stored on the base itself.
Westinghouse bought the property in 1966, and the vast space was used to house a comparatively small-scale venture.
This is basically the layout of the hangar when Westinghouse had it as a cabinet factory for almost 30 years.
During which they eventually lowered the ceiling to keep heating costs and the noise level down. Over the next few decades, many of the base's buildings were razed, and nature began to reclaim some that remained, like the old power generating station. TCOM moved into Hangar 2, where it built and serviced blimps and aerostats, at least until August the 3rd, 1995, when a welder's torch sparked a fire and the hangar, built with southern yellow pine, went up like a collection of giant matchsticks. There was no way to save the building, and when the smoke cleared, huge concrete support pillars that marked the structure's four corners were left standing and tower over the landscape today. A year later, the furniture factory moved out of Hangar 1, and TCOM moved in. If the giant hangar had a heart, it no doubt would have beat contentedly to house lighter-than-air craft like this one once again. Taking to the air to begin its career in intelligence gathering, reminiscent perhaps of the silver shape so familiar to post-war kids who used to run out of their houses in the 1950s shouting and pointing at the sky whenever a blimp flew over. Today, the aerostats in their hangar are reminders of a time that seems to recede further and further into memory as each year passes. Drive slowly past this astonishing structure and think for a moment about the time when much of the world's freedom hung in the balance, and how the U.S. helped tip that balance in favor of the Allies. Not a single ship was said to have been lost to a U-boat when escorted by North Carolina-based blimp squadrons. The cargoes those ships carried were not lost. Their crews did not die. Along with their compatriots elsewhere, the Weeksville sailors gave their all, never knowing what they might encounter with each flight, never knowing even if they would return. And for that, we remain forever in their debt.